Hi folks, welcome to our next Init 6 video. This week we've got yet another special guest with us and someone who you might recognize, hopefully. Jeremy Schulman joins us, network automaniac from Twitter and certainly someone you'll be familiar with if you're in the network automation community. Jeremy, do you want to give us a quick introduction?
Yeah, hi. Thanks for having me on the show. I really appreciate it. My name is Jeremy Schulman. I've been exclusively focused in what I would call the modern network automation space, probably since about 2011, 2012. We can kind of talk about that backstory later.
I was going to say, that's a long time back.
Yeah, for sure. And now I head up network infrastructure automation at Major League Baseball.
Great stuff. And again, there's a topic of conversation right there. So that's great stuff. So you already mentioned 2011, 2012. Now, most of us will probably, I don't know, what was I doing in 2011, 2012? I think I was just getting into a kind of a network design based type role at that stage. My IE was settled. I was recerting. I was getting on with just being a network guy. And that's what we were, right? But you clearly weren't. So do you want to talk to us about that transition and that time and what that looked like?
Sure. Yeah. So I've never been, a network engineer, honestly. I graduated college back in the 90s with a computer science degree. And for a very long time, I was a hardcore software engineer. I worked for companies like Motorola and other telecom companies building real-time embedded software. So I was a protocols engineer. I built protocols. I wrote protocols. And along that journey, I had a consulting company. I did, software for hire. And in 2004, I made a transition from being kind of the software engineer developing code to working with customers as a sales engineer. One of the companies I was doing work with asked me if I would take on a sales engineering role, which I'd never done. And I said, sure, I'll give it a shot. And that was back in 2004. And ever since then, I've really been on the field-facing side of vendor activity. So 20 years in vendor land, software engineering and field engineering, and MLB is my first customer side experience.
Yeah. We'll come back to that in a minute, actually. I'm interested to hear about the transition out of the vendor space, but you've got some interesting vendors as well along the way, and networking vendors I'm thinking of specifically. But do you want to just elaborate a little bit more about that? I mean, I'm interested obviously in your time with Juniper and the work you did there, and then where it's gone from that. But fill in some of the gaps. So
yeah, sure. I joined Juniper back in, I think it was 2008, as part of what was then called Strategic Alliance. And my goal with that experience was to develop business development skills from a technical point of view. So working with our really major partners like IBM and Nokia and some of the really big companies to try to figure out how we could sell together solutions. And what I learned from that experience from a technical point of view was if we could find a way to integrate these various components together through software automation above and beyond just selling, the tin and the software apps, it made for a better sale experience. And that's when I started to learn about Junos automation and all the kind of bits and pieces of what you could do with Junos. And I was very fortunate to be mentored by the individual, the principal or the distinguished engineer that invented Junos automation and the whole automation engine. He also lived here in Raleigh, so he was my mentor, and I learned from him directly, which was an incredible experience. And then through that, I continued to focus on how to apply network automation as a vehicle through which to differentiate our product sales with our customers. And the real turning point in this whole experience was when we were working on an account with a Fortune 5 company, I'll call it, and they wanted Puppet to be on the switches, not for their network engineers, their app team, so that they could manipulate, just some minor VLANs and port interface kind of things through Puppet, because that's what they used to roll out their apps. And I was like, what's Puppet? I had no idea what Puppet was. And so I talked with some of the people at Juniper IT to learn what Puppet was and how to think about infrastructure differently the way the server team was doing it. And then I ultimately wrote a Puppet agent to run on, the Junos boxes, and implemented kind of a vendor agnostic library to facilitate what they wanted. And once I realized, and this is again going back into like 2012, once I saw what the server teams people were doing with infrastructure as code technologies like Puppet and Chef, I made that pivot point. I said, I'm not doing anything but this now. I'm going to figure out how do we apply these technologies, these techniques, this line of thinking to the networking space. And really that was the 2012 transition point for me.
So you didn't know about Puppet, but prior to that, was it pretty much focused on, Python kind of, scripting and that kind of background, or was it more like in software dev, probably like PowerShell and stuff, I'm assuming, right?
It was, I want to say it was worse than that. It was worse than that. Yeah.
Pascal.
No. So
wow.
If anybody's familiar with Junos and the Junos automation engine, it's an XML-based automation engine, and their programming language was effectively an XML programming language. So under the hood, it was XSLT, and they had a mechanism to make it look a little bit more like Perl, which was better. And so I was really focused on, all of this on-box scripting and scripting using, these native tools. And I really didn't get into off-box automation programming until my experience with Puppet, which was Ruby. So I built a Ruby, netconf piece of software. And then when I started working with Ansible, back when Ansible was just 4 people, I transitioned into, writing a lot of Python. And that's when I wrote the Junos PyEZ package, got that off the ground. And that's when I kind of shifted from doing kind of on-box scripting to off-box. And then that really kind of opens up your mind to all the things that you can do.
See, this is the thing that interests me about all this, because obviously as network engineers right now, we're being told, right, okay, what you've got to do is you've got to learn automation because it's gonna change the way you do your job. What your view of the whole thing was much more strategic than that, right? You've come right the way back and you said, look, IT generally needs to work more integrated. It needs to be orchestrated almost, rather than automating the bits and pieces. But in order to make that work, you need to understand the automation and then fit that together with the broader ecosystem, right? And it sounds to me like you had that plan right from the beginning, and this has been a sort of driver for your approach from the start. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, in hindsight, it looks like I planned it. But,
a plan, yeah.
I think that, you just have to keep your eyes open for, the world of opportunity is really all around you. And it's a matter of seizing what you can and working in positive working environments. I'm extremely fortunate to be working at MLB. I've got exceptional, leadership support from the top down to do these types of activities. So I'm in a very amazing, position at MLB to do the types of things that I'm doing. But really where I had the aha moment for how it all fits into the business world is through my experience as doing technical business development, because really you start to focus not on the technology, Puppet versus Chef versus, Python versus Ruby, but really what are the business drivers that make automation important to the business, not to the network engineer to help them do their day job, because most of the time the business doesn't really care about that. They want to know, how does this piece of technology benefit or impact the business? And every time we were able to make that connection, in a very complex sale, we would always win. It didn't happen often. I say it always happened, but when we were able to make that connection at a very high level in the organization to show that value, we would always win that deal. We displaced, Cisco out of accounts that had been there for 15 years. We sold, really huge deals through, and in part, our story around automation technologies.
Yeah, I was just going to say, so this is about making again, making something that's part of an ecosystem that's able to show operational value to people outside the immediate technical area, I suppose, and to show that the business outcomes that we're always told are the things that we should design for really do make a difference. Looking at the devnet certifications and all of these cool things that are happening for network engineers now, they're driving things from kind of the ground up. Clearly, we also need people to be able to look at this from the top down and say, right, okay, yeah, understand where this fits into the broader picture, and understand the improvements that can be made at that top level.
What's interesting though is nobody's talking about the really important segment of the business. They always talk about the bottom up and they always talk about the top down, but they don't talk about the middle.
Okay.
Right? Why isn't anybody talking about the middle? The middle, it turns out, and I mean this sincerely, is actually the most important part. Because if you go too high in the organization, they really, the technology bits of the network are just not very important. Yeah. Unless you're a service provider, the network is a critical liability to the business. I mean, it's important, and if it goes down, bad things happen, but it's not the money maker. If you're a service provider, it's different. Every time we would do business with a service provider, there was no question about whether or not they were going to do automation. It was like, we're doing automation because we have to. The question is what technology and how are we going to make it happen as fast and reliable as possible? You flip over into the enterprise space and it's completely different. It's sort of like, we don't want scripts going wild to burn down the network, because reasons and all sorts of things. But so it's really hard for people at the very high level of the organization to understand the impact of network automation unless they've done it in a previous company. And they, for example, if you have a leader who came from a service provider-like environment, and they're now at an enterprise, they understand, the benefit because they've seen it firsthand. But
sure.
But in other organizations, it's really the middle layer. It's the middle layer that's most important. And I'll explain what I mean by that. Every network engineer works with other teams, whether it's the server team or maybe it's the media team or the, whatever teams there are. And those teams interact. If there's an InfoSec team that's separate from network engineering, they work together. These are what I mean by the horizontal or the middle section of businesses. And when you look at those interface points, how teams work together, what I do is I look at how can we apply automation technology to those relationships in a way to reduce friction between the teams. Because, in our case, we have ballpark engineers who need to do stuff with the network. They either need to know what the network's doing, or they might need to make a VLAN change or bounce a port or do something, so they need to interact with the network, and they don't want to wait for a human to respond to an email or a ticket. They want a self-service portal, for example. That's what I mean by the middle layer. Yeah.
So it's that ability to, I suppose, open up the network as a service, using to coin a phrase, but in a constrained and managed and way where change can be done, but it doesn't need to be done by an expert. It can be templated and blah, 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 but made accessible to the people who need the outcome, the technical outcome, to be executed, I suppose, is what you're getting at there, isn't it? And then I suppose that would also make sense for all of the monitoring and the visibility that's associated with that as well, right? It's making that information available to people who wouldn't necessarily normally see that,
That's right.
but
Yeah.
in a controlled way.
Yeah, but there are easy things I wouldn't say easy, but there are opportunities where teams interact in a way that a network engineer who's just starting out on the how can I develop my skill? How can I go from, somebody who's a novice or a beginner with, all this automation stuff to somebody with a little bit more core competency and experience. And I've often said, hello world is not automating the network. Automating the network is a ridiculously complicated endeavor. It is, in fact, the worst. I'm going to preach a bit, but I think it's the worst place to start. I mean, it's even like the most obvious place to start. It's actually the worst place to start. I mean, unless you're a software engineer and you really understand all the complexities of dealing with, a vast distributed system called the network, that's application software that you didn't write, called vendors, that are full of bugs with poor documentation and constant CLI changes. I mean, it's the worst. It's just the absolute worst.
Yeah, no, it's definitely very complex because it's not just, one device in between, right? It's, a lot of times when you're connecting, you hit an access point that hits a controller, that then hits a switch, that ultimately hits, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 routers, right? And those could either be physical or virtual. And if you talk about network automation, there's everything along that path, right? That packet goes has to be configured in some point of, form or fashion. And, I think you hit your concept of the middle layer is something that resonates very well with me, because it's like, when I first started looking at like network automation, my resistance to it at the time was it was all just about scale and making things operational efficiency, right? So the only ones that were automating were the service providers, because they were the ones that were doing the same task 1,000 times an hour, right? Or whatever, setting up customers and stuff. And so anybody that was doing, oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say the other people would have been public cloud or big data center environments, similar.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Just, I mean, the point is, it was all geared around operational efficiency, right? And then the people that are the really two buckets: operational efficiency, and the other bucket was the play bucket, right? The person that just wanted to kind of go out and learn to automate this one little task, and maybe wanted to learn PowerShell or do something. And I kind of took a different path to you. I was a computer science major too, and I think some of us. But how I got into networking was I decided I didn't want to spend my life looking for a semicolon that was in the wrong spot, right? So that's literally how I got into networking back in the day, right? The late '90s, and because at the time the dot-com bubble was still going on, and so everybody was going down the web development path, right? And so I'm like, yeah, I'm not going to go do web dev and spend looking for a semicolon in Java, right? So, but no, that middle layer and finding ways to bridge the teams and make them, tear down that kind of that network server, that those political barriers within teams within an organization, right? They can a lot of times can be really hindrance to the organization because they don't talk and they don't work together, right? And that's one of the reasons why nothing gets upgraded sometimes, right? Because it's not a priority for them.
Yeah, I mean, when I had this conversation about what does hello world look like for network engineers, I asked them, do you use a spreadsheet? And they're like, yeah, we use spreadsheets all the time. I'm like, do you share information between your teams with spreadsheets? Does the server team give you a spreadsheet like, here are all the ports, these are the VLANs that need to be on these ports, or it's like they go, of course we use spreadsheets. I'm like, great. Have you ever thought to automate the extraction of data from spreadsheets? Like, start there, because if you use a shareable spreadsheet like Google Sheets or some form of collaborative system, they all have APIs, right? So don't email your spreadsheets around. Stop doing. If you're doing that, stop, please. Don't do that, because then you have no, you don't know what's what. But a lot of times people share information in spreadsheets. The spreadsheets are in a shareable and programmatically accessible environment like Google Sheets, and it is a great sandbox environment, if you will, to learn some core competency and programming skills. The server guys give you a spreadsheet. Maybe that spreadsheet isn't really oriented in a good way. The information is a little bit fuzzy. It isn't, the columns aren't so great in terms of the content that they're putting in there, right? And so you go through this process of refining what the structure of that spreadsheet looks like. Maybe I've got, a column for VLAN and a separate column for IP address, and, whereas maybe they just kind of mush data together. I mean, you'd be surprised what people put in a spreadsheet. And so the first step is just working with people to say, look, I can give you a better quality of service, if you will. You give me information and I can turn that information into a network. If we work a little bit better to clean up our spreadsheets, and then that way, every time you change your spreadsheet, I can run a script and boom, I make a change. And we did this. Like, I actually went through this exact exercise when we were building out our headquarters in New York. We built this massive headquarters. We had tons and tons of spreadsheets, And I worked with the network engineers who were the authors of a lot of these spreadsheets. And the first thing that we did was we first kind of cleaned up. We put the spreadsheets in a better hygiene, and they saw the thought process that I went through to do this. And they're like, okay, I get this. I understand the way that you're thinking about this. So the next time we do this, that is as done. Like, get that out of the way. And then every time that they make a change, they're like, okay, click a button, generate configs. Now, they didn't write that script. They weren't interested in that script. What they wanted was the outcome of that script. And that's, I build tools for, that outcome. And when they're ready to learn to build tools, then I can mentor them. And some of them are doing that. And some of them are happy to use tools that I build, which really, leads me into another topic, which I'm going to take a pause before I go into. But that, I always say, hello world is automate a spreadsheet. Start there, because that is the API between teams. The way I look at it, that is the API between organizational teams.
So it's a key point, isn't it? Is that if you're doing the automation and the rest of it, the information that you're carrying has to be good and it has to be consistent, because otherwise you're going to end up in a scenario where bits of the network are doing different things or whatever, and different people have different views of what it's doing. So I guess that's fundamentally the use case for what you're describing is that hygiene of the data is about making sure you've got consistent, centralized, single view of your network, whatever that network may be. That makes sense. So all right, I'm going to prod a little more on the tool point that you just made before there. So again, as network engineers, we're all told, right, learn Python, go build tools, all the rest of it. Do we all really need to be building tools, or is that just going to end up that we'll all end up doing our own thing and never really grasp the thing you've described, really, that idea of having a consistent and a view that can be shared with the broader population in your business?
Yeah, so there's kind of 2 points that I'll make on it. It was interesting to learn how people use the word network automation. What I found was some people use that term to mean tools that you buy, or you borrow off the internet, open source. Like Netbox is a good example of what I would call borrow. Netbox is a very well supported project. A lot of people use it for their network inventory. They're borrowing it. And then there's other commercial products that are very good commercial products you have to buy. They cost money. They do a thing, and there's value to the business for whatever it serves. But network automation is I need a better tool. I don't want to build a better tool. I need a better tool, and often that's the right answer for the team that's involved in what network automation means. Because again, the business is about outcomes. They don't care necessarily about the tool that is being used to cause the outcome to happen. They want the outcome to happen reliably, and quickly, right? They want to go from, aha, we need to do something, to cha-ching, we're making money on doing the thing that we thought about doing. Aha to cha-ching. I borrowed that from the DevOps world. But more importantly, for the network and IT as a whole, they want to go from the, oh crap, something's wrong, to all clear, or at least we've kind of focused in on the area of the network that we need to really start looking at, really sharpening our focus in terms of what we're looking at. And so better tools to give you like a better X-ray or an MRI system, if you will, for your network. And this is where you get into like the dashboards and monitoring, those kinds of discussions, whether you're doing it proactively or reactively. But it's about tools for people. A lot of people, like yourself, Rick, don't want to build tools. I've heard the same kind of story. Like, yeah, I started out as a software developer. I hate tabs and spaces in Python or whatever, your semicolons are. For me, it was Lisp and too many parentheses, and they didn't want to do that. They want to use better tools. They don't want to build them, right? And then there's some people who just don't want to use tools. They're like, you're going to pry the CLI out of my cold dead hands because I'm a CCIE and that's how I get paid. And, I think that, that's been the last 3 or 4 years. And I think there's been a shift in that kind of viewpoint, partly because I think there are better tools coming out on the market, not because they want or don't want to use the CLI, but I think the last 10, 15 years have been dumpster fire or a road of broken glass when it comes to software that vendors provided to their customers or sold.
Yeah. Well, I think the other thing too is that's changed is the amount of information and code snippets that are out there, and so that tool is no longer this one big kind of car, right? But instead, you've got all these different Legos, right? And I forget which. We've talked about this on a couple of other ones, is where you take the different pieces of code and the little Legos and then build that tool you need. And also too, a lot of times because the businesses are cyclical, then the need for those tools are cyclical within an environment too. Like I imagine the level of automation at MLB is a lot different in season versus off season, or leading up to a game, or because it's not a 24/7 365 kind of thing in stadiums, right? And so being able to kind of spin those up as need be and then spin them back down, and adjust accordingly to the business is important.
Yeah. I mean, you're kind of touching on the second point that I wanted to make, which is, people who use programming languages as a tool, they don't want to tell their friends they're programmers. For example, I have friends who are chemists or physicists or lawyers, and data scientists, you hear, is kind of an in vogue kind of job description, but chemists and physicists and people who are in the sciences, they use programming languages every day in their job, in their day-to-day, to crunch numbers, work algorithms, and they're not a programmer, they're a chemist. They're using a language to achieve a goal. They'd use Mathematica, which is what they were doing before these fancy languages. I think that when I talk about network engineers and learning a new skill, they're still network engineers, and the skill that they learn, whether it's a little bit of PowerShell or a little bit of Python, should be enough to help them become more efficient to do their jobs. For example, sucking the contents out of spreadsheets and generating configs versus copying and pasting, and burning your eyes out. So people get kind of hung up on network automation, software engineer, net devops. To me, there's a reason for why people get hung up on that, and I respect those reasons. But at the end of the day, when people are asking, what should I be doing? Right? Where should I invest my time and energy? Right? It really depends on, the nature of what that person needs to do on their day-to-day job. They don't necessarily need to build the next greatest software automation, application at their company. It's probably not what they need to be doing, right? Unless you work at a Google or a service provider or something of that nature, where there's nothing you can buy and you have to build it.
Right.
Yeah.
Well,
that makes a great deal of sense.
I was just thinking of two things. Well, first of all, when you're talking about using these things, but people don't want to have someone say that they're a programmer, somebody that I worked for long ago when talking about building, or actually we're doing software development, but the comment that he made was you shouldn't have to have a master's degree in shovel to dig a ditch. It's not a very good tool if you have to have that much training on it. But the other part of that is, and you were sort of touching on it in the way you described it, is it's being presented a little bit differently. Earlier on, it really came across as, okay, we're going to automate the network, and all you, CLI jockey network engineers are going to be, out on the street with signs that say we'll route for food. Whereas now it's being presented a little bit more as this is something to help you to take care of drudgery more quickly and allow you to do other more interesting things. So I think it's a combination of things there that's caused a little bit of shift.
Yeah, I think that the industry as a whole, you did a real disservice early on in we'll call it the bringing to market of network automation. Code or die, CLI or die, like that made me sad and aggravated, because I had to have a lot of conversations with a lot of network engineers who were they had a lot of anxiety about it, and that was disappointing. I think things are better now, but at the end of the day, I think it's starting to temper. I think that is a little bit starting to temper. The problem is that at very high levels in the organization, like say a vendor comes in and talks to the VP and it's like, you got to automate this and send all your people to get certs and blah, 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 blah. And then the world will be a happy place. And oh, by the way, buy my product because it's the most automatable, in the world. I think is also doing a real disservice. And there's a little bit of insidious disservice in that. And I'll explain what I mean. Again, I was never a network engineer, but I've spent my entire career in the networking space. And so I get and have attended training and certification. That's something I need to know how to do. And so let's say that I was working at a company and my company said, you know what, we're going to start doing some MPLS stuff. So I'm going to send my staff to go take a 5-day course, learn MPLS, and they go to the company, and they learn all the commands, and they go through the labs. And at the end of that exercise, they are somewhat competent to follow best practices and design guides and actually implement an MPLS service. And if they get stuck, they can go to that company for support. So at the high level of an organization, there's an expectation in senior management that if I send you to training, you're going to come back and you can do a thing, and you're going to probably do a pretty good job of that thing, and you'll have support if you get stuck. This is not true when it comes to software development. This makes me so, again, sad and disappointed that this conversation is not happening, because what's going to happen is we're going to send people to training. They're going to get this DevNet certification, which I think is great. I mean, I applaud Cisco wholeheartedly with what they're doing, right? It's fantastic. It's shifting it's evolving the industry in a way that needs to get done. So, I mean, by what I'm saying here is by no means a rub against what they're doing. I really love what they're doing. But what's going to happen is through no fault of theirs, they're going to send people to DevNet certification. They're going to come back and say, I'm certified, so now I can automate the network. And then you get back to Rick's point. It's like, well, what does that really mean? And how big is the blast radius of failure when somebody who doesn't have that experience does something, whether they're afraid of doing it and their management's afraid of doing it? I mean, it's setting the wrong level of expectations. And it's only because of our past that is setting that expectation wrong. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense.
For me, there's this idea that introducing automation into the networking certs is a really good approach from my perspective, because it does introduce those ideas and bring those things to the networking guy and gives them more tools in their toolbox, right? I think the DevNet certs are where it's kind of flipped on its head, and it's about trying to build network developers. So as a software developer with a network slant, I think is a whole load more complex and fits with what you're saying really about that ethos of a business, that they need to look at things in a completely different way if that's the approach they want to take.
Yeah, I'm very jaded because I'm old and I've seen a lot, and I've been on the vendor side a lot.
We're all old and jaded here. It's all fine.
Part of the thing that is disappointing is when a vendor will say, become a network developer, so we don't have to build the software and sell you crap, right? There are companies out there, there are vendors out there, network vendors, that actually build some pretty nice quality software that does configuration, template building and pushing, and software upgrade, and give you telemetry visibility. I mean, there are companies out there that build quality software. There's not many, but there are some. And then at some companies, there's pockets of product that are good. But it's kind of a I don't know the right word, but it's like a vendor saying, well, learn to become a network developer and you can build your own tools. And wouldn't that be great? Like, is it? Is it really great? I mean,
learn to build a car so you can be a shade tree mechanic or something.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, I don't want to become a mechanic just to drive my car to the grocery store so I can buy macaroni and cheese. I just want to eat the macaroni and cheese, man. I mean, now I'm getting macaroni and cheese delivered to me in a box, like.
Well, another interesting thing that I think is actually helping with this kind of transition and get people more comfortable, because some people don't just want to automate because, especially on like a core switch, because they're worried about a resume generating event, right? as a result. But one of the things that I like about what Cisco's done in their latest kind of software stuff and things like, ACI in the data center as well as controller is you can still use the UI, right, and the GUI. And then with the click of a button, you see the equivalent of like a JSON output, right? So I think it gives a good bridge to correlate UI tasks to code in a safe manner, right? To be where your changes are still implemented through the GUI, right? That everybody's used to and likes, but you can start learning JSON, or you can start learning XML, or start seeing how that interaction occurs, and then eventually, maybe not tomorrow, but maybe the next time that change comes around, you do a little bit, right, of the XML or the JSON, right, and automate just this one little piece of it. But given that, being able to go back and forth in that visibility, I think has been, a really good thing for learning for, DevOps and stuff.
I agree, like 100%, and that kind of ties back into the hello world that I was going into, which is, a spreadsheet is like the easiest form of that, right? And so if you were using Google Docs or Google Sheets, you can see their API. But even better, you can download a Python library that really makes interfacing with the spreadsheet easier. You want to reduce that friction between a network engineer going, hey man, I want to pull data out of a spreadsheet and template build some configs. What has to happen to reduce that aha to cha-ching, feeling, right? Well, if there's a client library that somebody's building and supporting and developing, like there is for Google Sheets, great. Or for Cisco ACI, if they have client libraries that their DevOps team supports, devnet or whatnot, it becomes a safer experience for that network engineer to go, here's what I see in the UI. I'm not going to move my hands around because my green screen is terrible. Stop doing that. But they'll see a task that they want to do through a user interface, like you described, and then use a client library that somebody else built with quality and perhaps some form of support to articulate the API in a way that achieves the same outcome. So maybe they begin with like, oh, I'm going to change the description field in some UI widget through the API, and they click on it and they see that change. You're like, oh, okay, that's pretty cool. I mean, you would get that experience with a spreadsheet, same kind of deal. You can read and write to a spreadsheet, but you're on the exact right path. And there are companies out there. When I look at vendors and I see a UI product, I always ask, like, how quickly can I see your API interaction? And a lot of them, they'll say, well, click this button and you'll see all of our API docs. Aren't they pretty? And I'm like, yeah, that's okay. It's like going into a grocery store and seeing, aisles of food, but it doesn't tell me how to cook a turkey dinner, but there are other companies that act like you said, you click a button and it'll show you, this is the API with all the values that you need. And I could literally copy and paste that into a browser and run it. Or some of them will give you Postman, what are called Postman collections.
Collections, yeah.
That's another thing I've seen. And so we're starting to see more and more vendors invest in that, customer experience, whether they call it DevRel or, developer relations or customer engineering. It's very nice to see that is actually happening more and more. So you're right on, dude. You're right on.
I think another one of the things when you were talking about, people selling products or training or whatever, and we'll make you a network developer. And just as a way of background, I did software. I was like a programmer analyst for 10 plus years before I went into networking. But it's very much the same when you're writing programs. You may know how to program, but if you don't know the task that you're trying to program, you're kind of compromised. And that's why you have to understand how to program it, but then you also have to understand what you're trying to write the program to accomplish. And that's, now we're trying to take people that understand the network and teach them a little bit of programming, which maybe it's easier, maybe it's not. But, if you get somebody that tries to program something, they don't know how a network works, there's no telling what you're going to end up with afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, it's, again, going back into the role that I'm at, I'm part of the network engineering team, and I work with very smart network engineers that are domain experts. And so you put the two of us together, it's a Reese's peanut butter cup. I mean, I know enough networking because of my 20 years in the field that, I know these protocols and I know what they mean. I don't know how to design and run a network. And through just this new experience at MLB, I see the operations of a real world network, which is ridiculous. Like, I mean, when I'm at a vendor, I'm like, oh, well, you could do this, and you could write a script to do that, and whatever. And then there's the real world. The real world is very different from a vendor's point of view at times, unless they've also been in an operator's chair. And so I couldn't agree with you more. Putting those two people together is an excellent approach. And there are specialty shops, consulting shops that are doing exactly this. I've seen a couple of them. I worked with, when I was at Juniper in the early days of network automation, I saw very large companies experiment with this same exact idea. They took some network engineers and they took some of their software people off the web dev team, and they're like, you're a new team, go forward. And the first time I ever saw that, I was so excited about that. I was like, wow, this is really cool. I'm gonna watch this. And so I went back to that customer, it was like 6 or 7 months later, and I'm like, how'd it work out? And they said, the software guys quit. They said, automating the network was terrible. There's no APIs. Everything changes. The documentation is garbage. They didn't like screen scraping. They're like, they're out. And then they disbanded. I'm like, yeah.
So they were too soon, clearly. All too soon, right? Because you think now, you've already said you look for it in products yourself now. The first thing you look for is, how can I use the API how to do the things I need to do? Surely we're getting to a stage now where everything has a usable API, are we not?
No, absolutely not. The reason why the software team quit, I really want to kind of touch on this, is as a software engineer myself, growing up building software and buying software, third-party packages, and integrating them into product, because when you're building a router, you might buy a library for your operating system. You might buy a different library for your CP stack, and integrating those things together. There is a set of expectations that when you do that job, you get an SDK, you get documentation, you get debuggers, you get all sorts of stuff that is an ecosystem around the use of software, right? And as a software engineer, there's an expectation for that, right? And in network automation, that doesn't exist. It simply doesn't exist. So if you're a software engineer and you're plopped into the middle of automate the network, you're like, okay, well, where are all the tools that I'm used to having? Where are all the cookbooks, the documentation? Where's the support? Like, where is that? It just doesn't exist. It's getting better. I don't want to say it doesn't exist. Ask me 5 years ago, it didn't exist. Now it's getting better. And I think the Cisco DevNet thing is really moving that along. But it still isn't there. And so, no, not everything has an API. And then you get into the real world that you have an estate of infrastructure that is legacy, and it's never going to have it. So it's going to have to age out, or you have to make a choice. Is the juice worth the squeeze in terms of doing some automation?
That was going to be my last question, actually, was and I only thought of this one before, but the point is that you've got a network is never a greenfield thing, right? It's never built in isolation. It's never rock up, do something that you can start from scratch and it will just operate on its own. You've always got legacy. You've always got multiple different networks that you're bringing together and trying to make them work as one. And so you're always going to have that problem, right? Where you're going to have things that are automated potentially in different ways, or you may not be able to automate bits of it, or you may have to use screen scraping for one bit and API for another, or whatever. That's the art to this now, isn't it? Is how you bring all those things together.
Yeah, we look at automation, or just any job really, from a risk reward scenario. Is it a risk to the business to do the thing? Should we wait to the off season to do it? To your point, Rick, like our rhythm of business. And then there's just, is it worth it? Like, there's just some things that aren't worth it. They don't happen enough, or it's too risky to automate because it's too complicated. And when we kind of fall into that discussion, then I try to deconstruct it into, well, are there parts of this workflow that are less risky? Is there a way that we can take a very complicated problem and break it down into smaller pieces, and maybe do something to automate an aspect of that, like gathering data, so that the network engineer doesn't have to spend 3 hours gathering data and synthesizing it to then realize where in the network he needs to go, focus on. Maybe that's an area. So not trying to do a root cause analysis, autonomous system network solution, because I think that's just, morbidly silly, for most cases. Autonomous networking. Yeah. Okay. Whatever.
Yeah, no,
don't get me started.
It's like
that.
I think there's two really things that come into play. Is one, the complexity of applications today is a lot more complex than it used to be, right? Where you've got applications that reside in multiple areas, multiple clouds and stuff. And so doing having, it's not just one API you're connecting to, right? When you're trying to automate, it's anywhere from 10 to 15, all right? And for the companies that are focused on API, there's still to Jeremy, I agree with you. There's a lot that you would think in today that there's everything's API today. No, I just came from, I know software companies that started in 2015 that the API is only a fraction of what you can do in the UI, right? And until we get to a point where the API is the first thing that's developed and you can actually do more in the API than you do in the UI, then we're always going to kind of struggle with that, right? But, and for companies like those companies that are API focused, like the Google and the AWS, like I imagine, linking it to what we were talking about before, Jeremy, about this, this baseball season, right, of the shift of the StatCast from AWS to Google as the primary cloud, right? I imagine there was a lot of automation of things like maybe Terraform or something like that would automate moving that whole infrastructure over to GCP, right?
Yeah, and what was really interesting about that is, so we have a cloud engineering or systems engineering team that, use all the really interesting and sophisticated tools like Terraform, for example. And kind of going back to your API UI and learning or using a UI to then try to learn the API is such a great example in this story, because when we go and use let's say, for example, the Google UI, to see what routes were put in or what prefixes were put in through the Terraform engine that the network engineers were not responsible for. These are all the apps that go into the cloud. And, through, app development, pipeline magic, Terraform happens and then cloud happens and whatnot. But we can go in through the UI and we can kind of point and click around and see, what are the route maps and, the routing inside of the UI. And then if we wanted to, we could start exploring the API. We can start pulling data out of the API and then matching it up with what we see on the UI. And this becomes a very nice bridge for network engineers to experience programming. This is, to me, a more advanced hello world. Again, using Google API is using software where the API was first. Like, they said, we are going to sell a product, and that product is going to be driven by an API, and we're going to put vast amount of time and energy in making this the best API experience that gives the consumers of that API, which are application developers, more or less, because that's their business. That's how revenue happens. It's all about the applications. And so network engineers can benefit from that. They can use that learning experience, learn that API, or I shouldn't say that API, but learn a fraction of the Google API that's relevant to networking as a way to develop core competency skills. I totally agree with that. Yeah, for sure.
That's a really good point, actually, and I mean it's something, isn't it, that I know, Rick, you've started down that path. I started briefly as well, going down that sort of studying cloud from a networking perspective. But this is a broader view, isn't it? This is like you say, this is about learning cloud from an API point of view, to then take that knowledge, bring it with the networking stuff, and have that broader view altogether. So. Yeah, I really like that point, actually.
Well, I think when the difficult thing for network engineers with cloud is to an extent you have to unlearn some of the last couple of decades of networking, because the constructs have changed, right? A VLAN is not a VLAN. It's not called a VLAN in AWS and GCP, right? It's different things, right? So that's kind of the difference, right? It's just, and it's doing the same thing under the hood. It's just called something else, right?
Yeah. And what's really crazy is it's called different things in different clouds.
Exactly.
It's going to be called one
worse,
thing.
Yeah, even worse, they use the same term but to mean two different things.
Yeah, so when this happened, I'm going to tell you the story. So when this thing happened, which I'm going to say in a minute, I just sat back in my chair and I just laughed my ass off. It's like all of these developers that are using AWS and Azure and Google, and all the APIs are different and the terms are different. What we really need is to have one API that's the same across all the clouds. Wouldn't that be great? And then we wouldn't have to, we could write our apps once and then move them between cloud. It's like, you hear, I was reading this kind of, I wouldn't say they were whining, but they were expressing frustration with the lack of uniformity across vendors. And I'm like,
where have I heard that before?
There's a job for the rainbow unicorns, huh?
Right there.
Well, so I had an interesting thought as you were talking, and I was almost hearkening back to a more classical, like, software development thing, where sometimes you would have an analyst that would gather requirements and do kind of like a logical design, and then they would take that to a programmer. I mean, do you see any of this stuff going to where you're going to get sort of that kind of breakdown of tasks, as opposed to a network engineer that knows programming, where you're going to get somebody that is, say a network analyst, and they gather requirements and decide what you're going to do, and then take that to somebody that's a network programmer?
Yeah, so that could happen in a couple of scenarios. So I'm going to go back to, first and foremost, as a network engineer who's trying to do my job, I might learn a little bit of Python to help me do my job better, like pulling data out of a spreadsheet. Those are going to be very tactical activities. There's not going to be a lot of forethought into that process, because a lot of times somebody's like, hey, here's a spreadsheet, change all these VLANs and I need it done in 3 days. Like there's not a lot of planning and activity. So if you've got that core skill set, I can read data out of a spreadsheet and make configs, then you can start banging that out really fast. And those are very transactional. So that doesn't really apply to, that scenario doesn't apply to your question. But what does apply is when you have a lot of forward thinking into a large new build out, like when there's going to be a big build out. Like, for example, when we were building out and planning for our new headquarters, we had 3 or 4 months in advance. Like, we knew we were going to do this, right? So I could build very sophisticated tools in advance of when the equipment went in. And I spent 3 months building that software so that when they started to lay down the equipment, we had the high degree of reliability, the configs in place, and then auditing software to make sure that the smart hands were actually plugging things into the correct places, in a multi-story building. So I think in a few cases, and I don't know, I have a very limited view in the world of, what enterprise companies do. So I don't know how many times that they have that opportunity for a lot of forward planning to say, I'm going to build this tool, and it's okay if it takes, 3 months to build it, because it's also going to be worth the amount of time and expense to do it, especially if they're going to like an outside contractor to do it, because is the juice worth the squeeze? If they paid, $300,000 for a tool that they're going to use once, is it worth it? It may very well be worth it. Like, again, if you got to stand up a building and have it operational in 2 weeks, and you pay $300,000 to guarantee that is going to happen, that could be worth it to the business. Like, I actually had those types of discussions with business people when I was at Juniper. It's like, I could tell you like many stories where I had that discussion, and that's kind of how we won those deals. It's like, but you don't have those discussions necessarily with the network engineers, because a lot of times they're not privy to that kind of level of information.
Well, you sort of started down the road of military tech or terminology there, but there's a breakdown in some of this stuff is tactical and some of it is strategic. And what you're talking about on those is when you're getting into the strategic aspects of automation instead of just the tactical.
Yeah, I mean, and what's interesting to tie it back to the horizontal view of the industry, the organization is a lot of times you don't know what is strategic until you start experiencing their pain and activity. It wasn't until I actually understood the rhythm of the ballpark operations business to realize what's valuable to them. Not necessarily what's valuable to us, as network engineers or the operations team, but what's valuable to them. And once I started to understand that, when we could say strategically, we're going to invest in building some tools that, help the business along in that way. So, but that's very, it's not going to like, I'm not going to wake up and bang out a chatbot system in 2 days. I mean, that's not possible, right? But if they say, we use the Slack ops thing every day, during preseason, during the season, all the time, and it allows us to reduce the friction in our organizations and saves us X amount of hours, and we don't have to open up tickets and whatnot. mean, that's strategic. That's a strategic win. But
So-
it takes a lot of time
And
and
a
effort
lot
to
of
build those
times-
systems.
Yeah.
And to your point, a lot of times you don't know what's strategic until you're in the moment, or there's some kind of compelling event, or there's got to be something out there that make that happen.
I mean,
Yeah,
this,
and what's really kind of unfortunate is that a lot of times people are running into a burning building and wishing that they had a fire truck, but
Right.
you can't just make a fire truck happen. It's like you got to order one, and then you got to decorate it.
so
all
this
those
is
things.
this is just like network design, full stop, though, right? So you often have this scenario where you're bolting bits onto the network to keep it doing the thing it needs to do, because you've got to answer things quickly. When do you stop, do a proper go through a proper design process and set what those strategies need to be? And it strikes me that what we're talking about here is not just talking about, right, okay, here's my best design practice, this is how I'll go and build my environment, but what opportunities can I bring automation into that in order to improve the overall operations and not just focus on the network. So it's part of the from that network perspective, it's part of that network design process, but it has a much wider implication, because it meets, you're trying to meet those business requirements for a broader IT.
Yeah. Come on, who doesn't like working on a jet engine in mid-flight? that's the analogy we always
right?
use. Right?
Always. Yeah, I think, Jeremy, I think we're going to have to catch up again, my friend, because there's so much we could talk about, and I know some of the other guys would be keen to ask you some stuff as well. So, I'm going to thank you very much for your time, mate, and yeah, really interesting conversations. I'm sure everyone who's watching will get a lot from it as well. So, thank you very much.
You're most welcome. Thanks for having me again.
No worries.
Yeah.
Take care. Cheers, guys.
Cheers.
All right. Cheers.
Sorry. Thanks a lot. Cheers.